Welcome to Transformative Principal, where you learn how to be a leader and not just a manager of a to-do list. I am your host, Jethro Jones. You can find me on Twitter at Jethro Jones. Your to-do list is a hungry monster that is never satisfied. For the last year and a half, I've helped principals get awards, get promoted, and find the time to do the work that really matters. I recently opened a new mastermind slot. Schedule a call with me and let's overcome the stressed and isolated principal position together. Go to the show notes for this episode at transformativeprincipal.org and click Schedule a Call with Jethro. Welcome to Transformative Principal. I am excited to have on the program today Jenn David Lang from the mainidea.net and Kim Marshall from the Marshall Memo. And if you've been listening to the podcast, you know about the main idea, but you might not know about the Marshall Memo, which could be considered a sin in some parts of the world. So Kim, welcome. And why don't you start by telling us what the Marshall Memo is?
Thank you. When I finished being a Boston principal after 15 years, I realized that I had time to read, and I decided to subscribe to a whole lot of publications and start this weekly publication where I would summarize what I thought were the best articles for principals, school leaders, assistant principals, instructional coaches, superintendents, and other people who work very closely with schools. And I got it going in 2003, and I've kept it up 50 issues a year since then. So this week's is Marshall Memo 816, and it's about 10 pages long. So it takes me 20 hours to do each weekend. People can read in about 20 minutes and get a summary of the best ideas and the research.
Man, that is fascinating. And talk about dedication to do that for 16 years, 50 issues a year. That is a big deal. So you started that because you suddenly had this time and loved to read these kinds of things. So obviously you are a super educational nerd, which is just the kind of person I like to talk to on this podcast. So that's good. What made you decide to start summarizing and sharing with others?
So I realized that as a principal, I rarely had time to read in a thoughtful way, and much less, summarize and pass along to my colleagues these ideas that were out there. And so when I had time to read, and when I really could subscribe to a bunch of publications, I felt it was a real contribution to be able to bridge this gap between what the researchers are doing, good stories that are happening in schools, and I can tell a couple of those that are not research, but they're just teachers doing really neat things, principles. And I could get them to people in a form that they could read in 20 minutes, so that they really could fit it into the busy life of a principal or other school leader.
Yeah, I think that is really fantastic. And so the book, if you want to get it, it's called The Best of the Marshall Memo, Book 1, which is a ambitious title that you added the book 1 in there. I'm proud of you. Good job. And so if you want that, you can go to marshallmemo.com and you can learn more about that and get the Marshall Memo yourself. And my favorite picture, perhaps on the web, is a picture that is on marshallmemo.com, which is you sitting in a nice, relaxing chair reading a education journal. And I just got to say, Kim, I think that is fantastic. That's not what we're here for, but I love that picture of you that's on your website. So,
well, that's my Sunday is 6 or 7 hours going through this stuff that's come in that week. But why the book? So can I just talk briefly about that, or maybe Jenn, why don't you sort of say the bridge between the weekly Marshall Memo and then the book?
Great.
Sure. Yeah, Jethro, did you want to go somewhere else first, or?
No, that was where I was going to go next.
So each week when Kim summarizes the best journal articles, he's choosing from the journals that have come in that week, that month. And each Monday when he emails them out and we get them on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, the articles are not organized by any particular theme. So Kim had the idea, why don't we choose topics that principals are most interested in and most concerned about, and comb through the archives. He has over 8,000 articles in his archives, and choose the best articles on these different topics. So we chose 11 topics for the first book and 11 topics for the second book. And we are ambitious, but we do hope to get the second book out this year as well. And so each chapter of the book covers one theme, and there are about 10 to 12 articles. And then at the end, there are professional development ideas so that you can reflect on or share these articles with your teachers, your leadership team, and get some ideas for ways to use the book and the chapters and the articles for professional learning at your school or in your district or when you coach teachers.
So, you know that all these educational journals like Educational Leadership and Kaplan have a theme issue each month. And that's a good idea. What we did was a theme issue for all 16 years of the Marshall Memo. So we have a huge advantage over at leadership because we're able to look much more broadly over time and be much more selective. And also our summaries are much shorter. And so Jenn played an absolutely critical role in helping me to make these judgments. We worked very closely together to make these judgments about what are the best articles about, for example, time management for school leaders or difficult conversations for school leaders. And that proved to be much harder than we thought it was going to be. But we chose articles, we revised, we wrote introductions, and then Jenn is the one who really did these superb professional development suggestions to really put each chapter to work.
Kim has found that although lots and lots of people receive the Marshall Memo every week, not everyone knows how to take the next step from the learning to the doing and knows what to do with it. So we provide a number of protocols and discussion questions and activities that school leaders can use with their teachers or superintendents or district office people can use with their principals. So they can really use this book, not just to read and learn, but to actually implement new ideas tomorrow.
Yeah, reading and learning is certainly important. And, we all strive to be regular readers and learners. And as you said, there's just not always time to do that. And so being able to take the good stuff about a particular topic is really important. And so, you've got 11 in here from planning with a purpose for leaders to grading practices and a bunch in between there. And one of the ones that I wanted to talk about is this idea of critical feedback and difficult conversations, and recognizing that there are so many different ways to approach this, and there are so many different ways to offend people through these conversations and to make ourselves look not very good when we need to have difficult conversations. What is it that we can take away from this chapter about difficult conversations and critical feedback?
Well, one of the articles in this chapter, the 10th one, is by Tom Hoare, who I believe has been on the program.
Yes.
And it's a very practical article about the specific how-tos. And we're really we're into theory, but we're also into how-tos. And just to give a quick sense of what's in this article summary, which is just a page long, is don't email criticism. In other words, have the courage to talk face-to-face. Pick the time and place carefully. Be timely. In other words, don't keep the teacher in agony waiting for days and days. Be specific. Watch your body language. Provide a rationale. Let the teacher know you've been there too. Have some humility. Allow for a response and clarify what you said. And then praise more than you criticize. So those are Tom Hoare's very practical suggestions. But this is really on my mind today because I was in a school today observing classrooms. And by the way, during the rest of the week, I'm in schools working with principals and talking and consulting. And I was in a classroom with a couple of other observers, and we watched a teacher who was teaching quite well, but who made a mistake, a grammatical mistake on the board with the thing that she was teaching, an English skill that she was teaching. And all of us, when we went back to the office, we spent about the better part of 15 minutes debating how the principal who was in the room with us would approach this teacher with a very embarrassing thing of having the teacher having made a grammatical mistake that she was teaching in front of the kids and in front of some observers. Now, there's a difficult conversation.
Yeah. And that seems like a really low stress thing. Like everybody makes grammatical mistakes, but when you do it in front of people who are observing, that could be a very difficult thing for someone to take feedback on. And so what was the decision that you guys came to about how to talk with that teacher?
Well, it's going to be in the principal's hands because she's the one who has to do it. And she was going to do it that day. I mean, this is today. I was there this morning and she was going to talk to this teacher before the teacher left. One of the strategies we thought about was, and again, it's going to be her decision how to handle this, and she already has at this point, would be to maybe just write the word that the teacher wrote incorrectly on a piece of paper and just say, look at this and what do you notice? And probably at that point, the teacher's going to recognize the error And that might be a little less threatening than, say, you made a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm really concerned about this mistake that you made. That's a little more. So this might be a more indirect way of doing it. So that was one strategy we suggested. Another was to completely avoid it.
Yeah.
But I think it had to be confronted. And the teacher really needs tomorrow to apologize to the kids and straighten it out.
And one useful way that a principal could use this book, if you didn't happen to have Kim Marshall in your classroom to brainstorm ideas with, you could look through the chapter, and there are different viewpoints and different ideas. So, for example, the second article talks about all the reasons why principals avoid difficult conversations and that you shouldn't. So maybe if they thought avoid it, that's one possibility. Maybe the principal would read this article and reconsider. Or another article, the 9th article by Corey Mitchell, it gives sort of 4 simple tips, which says to address a problem early, go light at it, make it about the behavior, not the person, and listen because maybe you missed something. Maybe the teacher was putting the error on the board on purpose to see if the kids could catch it, and you left the room before that part of the lesson came up.
Uh-huh.
So there are lots of tips in the article, in the chapter, from different viewpoints that principals can dip into and go out of when they're looking for certain guidance.
And that's that whole issue of respect, of really respecting how difficult teaching is and always having a face-to-face conversation with a teacher. Imagine if this principal sent an email criticizing one, perhaps, as Jenn said, perhaps the teacher was using a deliberate strategy. And by the way, one of the most interesting things we noticed in the classroom was, as we looked over kids' shoulders, was that one kid wrote this incorrect word down correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So the kid actually spotted the mistake and corrected it, but didn't speak up, perhaps because there were observers in the room, or perhaps because, I don't know. And of course, a subtext of this is another chapter in this book, which is teacher supervision and evaluation, which is principals getting into classrooms more frequently in more of a coaching role than in an efficient sort of inspecting role. And so that was the spirit that these principals were working on, and very much of a face-to-face conversation, focusing on one thing. And that probably was the big thing to talk about, and then to allow the teacher to explain what was going on, their rationale, admit the mistake, or to talk about the strategy. So it really is part of these chapters. Really do sort of fit together, getting into classrooms more frequently, being respectful and tactful, but also brave with these conversations that have to be had. Those are some of the most important chapters in the book.
Yeah, and I think an important piece to highlight in this situation is that there is a reason why that grammatical mistake needed to be addressed and corrected, which you understood being there, Kim, but what was the reason why this really needed to be talked about with that particular teacher?
Well, I think she was miseducating the kids, and we just couldn't let that go by. And everyone, all of us, agreed that it was definitely something to address, and was the thing to address there. The rest of the teaching was fine. And there were other little things. I mean, what we always do when we go in is we would brainstorm all the positives, and there are usually about 10 of those, and then all the possible leverage points, and then decide on what the most important one is, and then talk through and actually role play, how to talk to the teacher about it. But in this case, it really jumped out as kids were being given misinformation and actually being confused, and it needed to be straightened out.
And I think a key point here is the culture that the leader has created in the school. Has the leader created a strong feedback culture where it's the norm to give and receive feedback, to hear, glows and grows from everyone, from the principal down? In the 3rd article that I wrote with Douglas Stone, we have a quote where we wrote, "There's no training you can offer, no teaching you can provide that will improve the quality of feedback at your school as much as your own example. Be noisy about the importance of improving your school's feedback culture for students, for teachers, for parents, and for yourself." So if you've created a school where it's the norm to give feedback, maybe this isn't such a difficult conversation. But if nobody talks like that in the school, then this may be seen as an egregious mistake and lead to a huge rift in the relationship between the principal and the teacher.
And I want to add quickly here that I don't want your listeners to get the impression that we're all about gotcha, coming into classrooms and catching teachers making grammatical mistakes and so forth. And most of the feedback is positive.
Right.
But when something happens that needs to be addressed, having the courage and then the tact and the skill to speak to the teacher in a respectful way and listen to the teacher. Notice in Tom Hoare's article, there was clearly the need to listen and to see what was behind this, and also compliment the teacher on things. And of the three teachers we visited today, one of them was just knocked it out of the park, terrific, really fantastic. And most of the feedback was just appreciation and kind of a verbal hug to the teacher.
Yeah. Well, I brought up that question of specifically why was this important? And your answer was because she was miseducating the kids. And that is so important to address because at certain times, especially if you're listening to this right now, that you may think, well, she made a mistake. It's not that big a deal. Like, that doesn't need to be corrected. She doesn't need to go apologize. You guys are taking this way too seriously. Like, lighten up a little bit. And somebody not understanding the context could say that's overreacting. And what I'm hearing you say is that this was not a math lesson, and she accidentally wrote the wrong kind of there up there on the board. This was likely an English lesson, and it was miseducating. The kids were getting the wrong information that they needed to be successful, and she was doing that. And the reason that I'm glad you brought up this really seemingly tiny example is because I had a situation like this as an elementary school principal where I was doing an observation in a teacher's classroom, and she did the exact same thing. And when I talked to my principal at the time, it was like, well, it's not that big a deal. And I just had this like feeling in my gut. This is a big deal because she just told, and I don't remember what it was at this point, but she just told the kids that this is how you say or spell or do something. And it was totally wrong. And I knew it was wrong. And I corrected her in the class in front of everybody, which I don't think was the right thing to do. And she made an honest, unintentional mistake, but it was so confusing and so wrong for the kids that they were going one way along with her. And then she made that mistake and she didn't catch it, but the kids did. And they were totally confused. And then I caught it and said something. And she was like, okay, thank you. That's good. But we had created that relationship, which again goes back to what you're talking about. It's so important to have that culture of feedback. She didn't feel like I was taking over her class or interrupting her. She felt like I was supporting her in the way that she needed to be supported, which was calling attention to that mistake. And, when you're in a principal position and observing teachers, this feedback is important, even if it might seem like it's not that big a deal and maybe we're going overboard. But I can assure you there's a need for it.
There's certainly one sense in which it's not a big deal because this teacher overall was doing fine. This
Right.
Boston teacher doing fine, good teaching, good preparation, good vibes for the kids, attention and so forth. And so it was little in that sense, in the context. And I think that's the other important thing is getting in the classrooms enough so that you see the bigger picture, so that you really are appreciating. Because another one of Jenn's articles is with Douglas Stone is this whole thing, these three things. Teachers need to be appreciated all the time because it's such a hard job. Both of my children are teachers, and I'm constantly reminded of how challenging and difficult teaching is, no matter what kind of school you're in. Secondly, being coached, and this was an incident of coaching where the teacher's going to take a critical point. And then the third thing is sort of knowing where they stand. Like, you're in good shape, you're okay. Don't worry, because teachers get very sensitive. Teachers are sensitive creatures, and they can be very, very touchy about, am I going to get fired? Am I going to get a reprimand? No, this is one small point. Put it in context and move on. And but you raised also, Jethro, the question of whether a principal should do this on the spot in the classroom. And that's a whole other issue. There's an article in the book about this, about the controversy of what's called real-time coaching versus talking to the teacher after the fact. And I think that's an interesting debate.
Yeah, give us a little more insight into that, Kim.
Well, actually, as you noticed, Jenn mentioned an article that she wrote that was summarized in the book. And this is an article that I actually wrote that's summarized in the book. So sometimes we pick our own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We're very, very selective, but sometimes our articles make the cut. And so I stumbled upon this because there was an article in the New York Times about a set of charter schools in New York City, the Success Academy schools, charter schools, where it is routine for principals to interrupt instruction while they're watching a class, take over the class, and demonstrate how it should be done. And this really struck me reading this report in the New York Times. So I actually did a series of interviews and talked to the head or emailed with the head of those schools and talked to other people in other schools and wrote an article for Kaplan, which I then summarized in the book about this particular approach. And just to give a little spoiler alert here, I did come down on more at the end of the spectrum of saying that the principal should hold their peace during the class, but then immediately talk to the teacher afterward. But there are subtle ways of doing it. For example, if the kids are writing or talking, working in groups, the principal might whisper to the teacher, for example, about that grammatical mistake. Or there's some people hold up a whiteboard at the back of the room with a little message for the teacher to see. There's a whole other thing of using a Bluetooth earpiece where the principal can talk quietly at the back of the room and the teacher can hear in the earpiece. So it's called bug in the ear. And all of these are sort of intriguing ways. But I think that the fundamental issue is respect for teachers and never, ever undermining the teacher's authority with kids. And you mentioned, Jethro, the idea of trust. If you have a really trusting relationship, some teachers might actually appreciate being corrected on the spot.
Yeah.
So it depends on the relationships too.
Yeah.
And I think it also ties back into the research about feedback that, sure, if you interrupt a teacher and you explain the correct way to do apostrophes on the spot, maybe the students for that 5-minute lesson will have the correct information, but that's not really going to change the teacher's behavior. The whole point of all these articles is how can you give feedback in a way that's heard and that actually changes behavior? As Kim often points out in his articles and books, leaders see a very small percentage of the teaching that's happening in the building. So you want to have a conversation and give feedback to a teacher in a way that will have a ripple effect for all those other times when you're not there. So it's the feedback receiver who decides whether she or he is going to use the feedback. So it's key to have that trust in that relationship. And it's important to have a conversation so that the feedback receiver, the teacher, comes to the conclusion about what behavior needs to be changed and how. So if you're just interrupting a class, even if you're whispering in their ear, it may not necessarily lead to change in the teacher's behavior.
Yeah, it may just embarrass the teacher or annoy the teacher. And so again, teachers are sensitive creatures. They need to be treated with respect. But of course, there are times when the principal needs to intervene if there's a dangerous situation, if there's something really abusive taking place. You might have to do it on the spot, and that would be, I think, the standard there. Is it a safety issue?
Yeah. Well, and in my situation, the teacher and I had a relationship where I could totally do that and felt confident, and we could laugh about it later. And I've had other teachers where I know they would take it super offensively if I interrupted them, and it would totally deflate them. And so being aware and self-aware of what your relationship is and how it'll come across is really important also. And I appreciate you taking that time to emphasize that point. So the last question that I ask in my interviews is, what is one thing that a principal can do this week to be a transformative principal like you? And you can each answer that. And Kim, you go first, and then Jen, you can finish it.
Well, the biggest challenge these days is getting out of your office, getting away from the email, getting into classrooms on a frequent, informal basis, having these face-to-face conversations. And one of the small tricks that I noticed a lot of principals using these days is during the heart of the school day, having an out-of-office message on their email that automatically emails back to the person trying to email them at 10 o'clock in the morning, saying, I'm in classrooms and in teacher meetings. It is my practice to focus on instruction during the day. If this is an emergency, here's a phone number you can call, but otherwise I will get back to you later this afternoon. And I think that simple trick of buffering the torrent of emails that is hitting principals every day and getting out into classrooms in an informal way, not the formal clipboard, iPad kind of thing, but informally walking in, looking over kids' shoulders, and always talking to the teacher afterward, face to face. That, I think, is such an important part of the principalship. And it makes the principal feel better going home at the end of the day. And it makes a much bigger difference in teaching and learning.
Yeah. Hold on, Jim, before you go, I think that kind of little hack that is a little trick you use to keep yourself sane. One of the things that I use with that is called Sane Box. And at the show notes at transformativeprincipal.org. There's a link to check that out. That's what I use to keep my inbox clean so that I don't see a ton of those messages that come in. But anything like that that helps with the torrent is really important. Thanks. Go ahead, Jenn.
Sure. Yeah. No, I like Kim's big picture look. I'm going to go small and focus on the topic that we were talking about today, critical feedback. I think one very small thing that principals can do tomorrow that will have a transformative effect is to, as I mentioned before, model accepting feedback. So look at your schedule for tomorrow. Are you running a meeting? At the end of the meeting, ask for feedback and then state how you're going to use that feedback. Are you coaching a teacher tomorrow? Ask for feedback on how you just ran that coaching conversation. I think that does a few things. One, you're creating that culture where here at this school, we value feedback, we use it, we welcome it, we ask for it from the top, from the principal. So you're modeling it, you're developing that feedback culture. And then also, as the leader at the top, you often don't really know what other people think. So you might have thought you just ran a wonderful coaching conversation, but the teacher doesn't feel that way. Or you might have thought you ran a very productive meeting and the teachers don't feel that way. So you're actually getting real concrete information. So it's something you can do tomorrow. Look at your schedule and figure out where tomorrow you can ask for feedback on you.
Yeah, I think both of those are excellent advice. Getting true feedback from the people you lead is a whole nother conversation that, Jenn, maybe we could talk about another time.
Mm-hmm.
If you would like to get the Marshall Memo, go to marshallmemo.com. You can get the book and the subscription to the summaries there. And I want to thank both Jenn and Kim for being on the podcast. And again, if you would like to work with me on any kind of consulting or have me come out to your school for anything like that, you can connect with me at jethrojones.com. Thank you so much to both of you for being part of Transformative Principal today.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Jethro. Thanks so much for listening to that episode of Transformative Principal. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I want to remind you, I am going out on my own. So I'm looking for opportunities to help schools implement things that are related to student-driven learning. So if you'd like to work with me, please go to jethrojones.com, and you'll be able to enter your information there, and we can schedule a chat to talk and figure out how we can help move kids forward and be in control of their own learning. Thanks so much. That's jethrojones.com.